We are joined today by three people who are going to speak to some of the innovations that they've been working on. We are joined by Rudi Schiebel. Did I pronounce that correctly?
That's correct, yeah.
Ah, good. Rudi is the CEO and founder of Habitat Life Sciences, and is creating a smart farming brand that reflects his belief that the relationship between agriculture and the natural environment is a partnership, not an entitlement. And I love that, so I'm going to repeat it. That the relationship between agriculture and the natural environment is a partnership, not an entitlement. Now, prior to starting Habitat in 2018, Rudi co-founded the Turtle Valley Bison Company, which is a ranch focused on holistic farming practices. In combination with his experience building sustainable local food chain systems, Rudi's mission is to create a truly sustainable farming model that pairs today's technologies with symbiotic farming models like aquaponics. Habitat's pilot farm in Chase, British Columbia, is the first facility of its kind to be certified organic under the Canadian Aquaculture Standard, producing organic coho salmon and organic craft cannabis together in Habitat's proprietary aquaponics process. This process recirculates 99.7% of its water and converts solid waste from the salmon farm into a water-based fertilizer for the cannabis plants, which is super exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing more. Thanks so much for joining us today, Rudi.
Thanks for the intro.
We're also joined today by Paul Shumlich. I hope I pronounced that right. Paul is the founder and the CEO of Deepwater Farms. Now, Deepwater Farms is an agricultural technology company specializing in controlled environment agriculture farming technology, as well as land-based recirculating aquaculture. Deepwater Farms is Alberta's leading producer of baby greens and sea bass and supplies grocery stores such as Calgary Co-op, Safeway, Sobeys, Community Natural Foods, as well as over 100 restaurants across the province. So I'm sure that we've all eaten your food at some point. They grow more than 100 tons of produce and fish per year. In 2019, the Calgary Herald named Paul a compelling Calgarian, an honor that is awarded to those making a difference in our city. Paul is an alumnus from Mount Royal University, where he completed a degree in general management with a focus on entrepreneurship and innovation. And throughout his university career, he competed in numerous business pitch competitions, winning over $150,000 in funding. And we've got some people in the room today who can speak to some of the experiences that Paul had in getting to the place that he's at. And we're also joined by Dr. Brad Mahone, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Continuing Education at Mount Royal University, who can also speak to some of the programs that are in place in continuing education at Mount Royal University for people who are interested in continuing or following in the journey that both Paul and Rudi have taken. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone, today. I've got some questions just to get us started with the conversation, but anybody who's in the room with us would like to ask some questions, feel free to just pop them into the chat at any point. You don't necessarily have to wait until the end to ask some questions. So if you want to contribute to the conversation that we're having with the topic that we're discussing, feel free to just pop something into the chat at any time. I think what might be nice, though, for as a starting point, for some of the folk that are in the room today, they might not be familiar with the terms that we've been using in your introductions, and I wonder if we could perhaps start with a definition of what food insecurity is, and what that means in your particular region. So maybe Paul, you could speak to your region, and Rudi, you could speak to your region, because I know that we're not in the same city right now, or maybe we are, but in terms of the farming that we're doing, they're not necessarily in the same region.
Cool. Yeah, I'm having some network connections, so issues, but I think I'm okay. Anyways, I'm in Calgary. So yeah, food insecurity. Originally, like my introduction to that was in like 2013 when Calgary experienced some severe flooding. During that period, that was the first time that I had ever seen the shelves of grocery stores be depleted in my entire life. I was 23 at the time. And I had never experienced that. I thought we were like very resilient. And so I really look at it as like food resiliency, because like obviously we have enough calories in Canada to feed everybody over and over again. And actually like we produce enough calories in the world to feed the entire global population. It's really a supply chain and distribution issue. But to me, like that was my real introduction to like, you know, oh, okay, like things aren't fully locked down. Like we don't have this all fully figured out. And then I discovered that like at any given moment, Calgary only has a 3-day food supply. And so to me at the time when I was in university and, you know, very like eager and you know, oh, the man's going to get us and whatever. But, you know, that was like my real like, okay, like, hey, we should probably think about this. And because like, you know, this flood that, you know, in Calgary that we experienced, like that's like, we should be able to handle that given our like technology and where we're at in the world. And so that's when I really discovered like we have supply chain issues. And that's where I was like, well, local food production can really help solve some of these issues. And so to me, that's kind of where it started. And, you know, that foresight came to fruition over and over again in the last 3 years when, you know, we had COVID and we had borders getting shut down and we experienced grocery stores getting depleted. And then we had roads getting washed out in BC and grocery store shelves getting depleted. And so each time that that's happened since Deepwater Farms has been around, you know, we sell out and we can't keep up with the demand as a result of that. And it's really helped us secure customers and purchases and contracts like that because you know we can meet those demands when basically stuff hits the fan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Paul. Rudi, what does food insecurity mean for you? And are you in Calgary right now, or are you somewhere else?
No, I'm in British Columbia. I'm in the Shuswap region of British Columbia. So
yeah.
But I think Paul touched on that perfectly in terms of through I guess you're going back to 2013, but more recently, starting in 2020 through the pandemic, and as he touched on as well, we had floods here and fires, and the roads were wiped out. I think we experienced very quickly how vulnerable the supply chain was in BC in particular. I think in the last 2 years, we've had three or four times where the grocery store shelves have been completely blown out of food, and experiences like the local dairy down the road was dumping milk because their supply chain was broken for them to export it, while the local grocery stores themselves didn't have any milk on the shelves. Mm-hmm. So there was this disconnect on how the system had been built, and I think the value that local producers and those relationships that local producers could have with their local supply chains. And so there's been a big shift, I would say, that we've felt over the last 2 years, that there's a lot more interest in building up those local food chains. How can you produce food? It doesn't even have to be within 100 miles. There's that whole 100-mile diet that came out, but even for Western Canada, or even on this side of the mountains, have more food production. And equally that down in the lower mainland. At the same time, BC, for example, imports the bulk of all their food, and so as well as a lot of the farm labor. So when the borders shut down, I think it was something like 30% of the berry crops that were in BC rotted on the plants because there was no one here to pick the plants and the food. And one of the only things that we currently export from British Columbia is salmon. And at the current rate right now, the federal and provincial governments are looking at shutting that down. So we have some very interesting political environment in terms of what we're doing for food security, and some things where I think we're looking at what we're not balancing, I would say, the need for food security, and looking at what we can produce locally and what's important versus that balance with the environmental standpoint. There's a right that we need to look at in terms of a right to access nutritious food, and balancing that to what our current infrastructure is for food production, and then what those environmental impacts are as well. There's definitely a challenge ahead of us, and I think that's part of our focus on producing new ways of producing food. How can we address some of those challenges?
Yeah, I think food insecurity is a big question, and like to really address it, you have to like understand like what lens are you looking at it through, whose lens are you looking at it through, and like ultimately what are the concerns or goals or outcomes that you're looking to achieve, and then you can kind of focus in on there and get specific on what needs to be accomplished or what needs to be done. So
I'm curious, is it different between British Columbia and Alberta? Like are the provincial governments, all those regulations, is it a different environment that you're both existing in right now?
I would say from Alberta is much more friendly to agriculture and farming. Land Commission here in British Columbia, which is mandated to support and retain land for agricultural purposes, but they've added so many restrictions and limited what you can really do, that there's a somewhat of an unfriendly environment, I would say, to agriculture, which we're working to try to change. And there's a pretty big agricultural community here that's working to progress that forward. But Paul, maybe you can touch on Alberta. But from my experiences, and even with Alberta contacting us, they're very interested in us trying to move to Alberta. So we have a lot of government interaction on that regard.
Yeah, I think specifically looking at aquaculture, BC has a much more like sensitive ecological and like an environment to operate within, and whereas like Alberta being landlocked, aquaculture poses a much smaller risk in terms of affecting native species of fish and animal, especially because like most of the fish and different species that you will be culturing are non-native to Alberta, and typically like a warm water species, which I mean, you don't really have too many environmental concerns of them escaping and you know, taking over as an invasive species because they can't survive winters. Whereas I think in BC, like you're going to have the risk is much higher of species escaping, more moderate climate, more water systems in BC as well. So I think that's probably a lot of the hoops you guys have to jump through in British Columbia through like Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the CFIA. And also like I just think that like Alberta is known for agriculture. You know, east of the Rockies is relatively flat. It's easy to develop land. And we already have so much agriculture infrastructure, and you know, like banks and lenders looking to diversify and get into new and upcoming agricultural technologies, like through a lot of different opportunities. Sorry, something happened on my computer there. But yeah, I think like Alberta is very keen to do that, especially with emerging technologies, like through Olds College, University of Lethbridge. Like they're trying to create super clusters and different types of innovation funding for agriculture, especially emerging technologies. Yeah.
That's great. I wonder if you could both speak to the kinds of farming that you're doing and the technology that's involved. So I know some of them are similar, but I suspect that some of them are different. And for those of us that are not familiar, if you could provide a little bit of a history and an explanation of what aquaponics is, that would be great for us. Thanks.
I could talk really quickly on kind of the history of aquaponics. The aquaponics is basically the combination of aquaculture and hydroponics. And so aquaculture is like the culturing of fish, and hydroponics is growing plants in a soilless media. And so the combination of those two is aquaponics. And basically you're taking fish waste, converting it into fertilizer, and then the plants uptake the fertilizer. And in theory, you can send that water back to the fish. Rudi can speak more to aquaponics and like the commercialization and success of it, because we've had to kind of steer away from aquaponics for some things related to the crops we're growing, specifically and just like our commercialization pathway, we've had to move our fish to a new facility to expand that, so that we had more room to expand our plants in our facility. So we're not currently operating as aquaponics, but that romantic story, that closed loop story, is what got me into it. And I think, Rudi, you can speak to it, what got you into it, but it was a really cool way of growing fish and plants and kind of creating this, you know, diet that you can basically create a pescatarian meal yourself and almost survive off it, because you can't just survive off lettuce alone. I don't think, at least. I'm not a dietitian or anything, a doctor of those means, but yeah, like a little, you know, so that was a cool story to me. And like at the time that was important to me, being able to kind of be self-sustaining and create that food security. And it seemed like a cool opportunity because it hadn't been done commercially yet. And so like aquaponics in history dates back all the way to like people introducing fish into rice paddies in like ancient China and Asia and things like that. But actually Lethbridge College was leading a lot of research on commercialization of aquaponics. And that's kind of where I gained a lot of confidence, was going down there, visiting the professors, researching it there, and getting a lot of insight and guidance on how to just start, basically. So I'll turn it over to Rudi for his definition of aquaponics, or whatever the question was.
Yeah, well, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the definition of what aquaponics is. I mean, there's, as you mentioned, it goes back to the ancient times, and then there's even reference in the Tower of Babylon in terms of the hangars and using fish to fertilize the plants in there. So the concept is very old. I think the use of it in pairing it with more intensive farming practices and ag tech today is relatively new. I think that doing it on land or in tanks and in controlled environments starts in like the 80s in the University of the Virgin Islands. Is kind of one of the first places that done that, and that was what was called a coupled system. And so what they had is fish and plants all living in the same water and just recirculating the water in a symbiotic way. And really the issue with that is that you have to keep parameters that keep everything alive in an intensive environment. And so you can never run the ideal environments for the fish as you want it for the plants or for the bacterial life that lives in the system that makes the whole system happen. And so decoupled or the coupled systems has really been what most people would think of in terms of aquaponics and how it's done. And there's been huge challenges in trying to scale that side of it because there's very limited control. There's limited traceability in terms of food quality and consistency that comes from it. And so really what our focus is in developing a process called decoupled aquaponics, which is taking all the philosophies of aquaponics, having them all live off of each other, but having them in different segment ecosystems. So the fish are in their own tanks, which is called recirculating aquaculture systems, where we're recirculating 99.7% of the water. And we're doing that through different types of filtration that has bacteria that treats the ammonia and turns it into nitrate, which is the base of plant fertilizer. And then we're treating the CO2 and water clarity for the salmon to the perfect parameters of what salmon need to thrive and grow from a commercial viability standpoint. And then all that waste in that, what growing in a closed system allows us to do is it allows us to capture all that solid waste from the salmon farm. And that's where we've really spent a lot of our time developing out our process in what's called mineralization. And so it's the recycling of that into fertilizer, basically into condensed fertilizer. And then from there that flows out through our hydroponics farm that's growing cannabis, and we can control and manipulate the nutrient ratios in that water to the ideal parameters for what cannabis need to be successful on a commercial standpoint. And all our water gets consumed from that side. We don't have that waste stream discharge of high nutrient water, which would normally come from an inland fish farm. And we get 2 crops that are coming out of the farm, both certified organic. Each one of those steps we've linked and controlled together through, I guess, what you would call the Internet of Things. So we have sensors everywhere. Everything goes back to our data. We collect all the data, and we have a full, I would say, heartbeat on the farming system or the ecosystem that we have there. And that relationship amongst everything is where we came up with our name and habitat, in terms of us creating our own habitat for the different species that we're growing to thrive and create a really sustainable but also profitable farming model.
Yeah, and what I think is really cool is that it's also certifiable organic. So Rudi, your farm is certified organic, I believe, for the fish and the plants. And so that's also what really got me into aquaponics as well, was that opportunity to differentiate your product as a certified organic product. And I think like the interesting thing about like what we've discovered and what Rudi's done a really good job of is like traditionally aquaponics has been a very like idealistic thing in terms of a closed loop recirculating coupled system where like the water just flows from fish to plants and back again. But when you're trying to commercialize, like you need perfect water quality for your fish and you need perfect water quality for your plants. So you actually do have to kind of separate the two. Like Rudi said, take that waste, break it down, make it into a perfect fertilizer, adjust different levels of nutrients, and then send that to your plants. But like a big challenge of that is that the aquaponics slurry, and Rudi, correct me, but like what I discovered was that like your nutrient values in terms of like your like different elements in there of like boron and molybdenum and copper and all those things are like, you can have a hydroponic recipe that has been researched and well vetted, and like, you know, all your milligrams per liter of each different element to make your plants grow successfully. But with the aquaponics nutrient solution, it's like those levels are different because like of the bacteria that's living within that affects things. And so it's such almost like an art that turns into a science to really discover what works with this industry. And it's like so early. And I think that really like Habitat is really an industry leader in discovering that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good summary of just the mineral, like where that mineralization, the importance of that comes in, and just how tricky it is to balance the life that's essentially that you're creating inside of what we call an aerobic digester. So we use existing technology that's used in the waste treatment industry, and the issues that come from that is that in the waste treatment industry, they're treating water to have all the nutrients in that dissipate, or to have nutrient-free water, and we're basically on the reverse of that. We're trying to use that to create the most amount of nutrients and minerals in there to feed plants, so that it's not turning into atmospheric nitrogen, and we're not pulling the phosphorus out through bacteria consuming it. So when we talk to people who use the technology, they basically admit to us every time, they're like, well, this is the exact opposite of what people are trying to do with it. So there's no literature, there's no information really on how to do it. So we've had to explore everything from what types of bacteria that you want to be growing within those digesters, to the temperatures, parameters, volumes of input, and just how you control that system to Paul's point, so that it's not so variable, so you can control the same amount of output coming out of that 12 months of the year. You can and you can scale that based off of how many fish you're growing. And so there's obviously a very technical element to both of the sides of the farm, and our goal at Habitat has been to create essentially the operating system so that stuff becomes very, very simplified in processes, so that anyone could turn on one of our systems and start growing in it. And that's been the last 3 years of development on that side.
Rudi, how big is your facility?
Our facility is about 10,000 square feet in total, so it's not a massive facility by any stretch. Especially if you go out to the Medicine Hat region, you start looking at the different greenhouses or indoor growing that happens out there. But we're producing about 4 tons of salmon every year out of our system. We do that on a consistent basis. So every week we're harvesting we're harvesting about 25 fish and those go just to local restaurants here and to a local fish distributor. So on that side, we're relatively small. It's been a pilot operation just to get all the processes in place. We're now working on scaling that side of the business up. That's a big part of our focus. And then we're growing about, on the cannabis side, we're growing about 600 kilograms of dried product per year. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but the potential revenue generating aspect of that side in a small farm is very strong. And over the course of the next few years, we'll look to expand that modestly. But the market for cannabis is we've identified as a very craft and niche market. So the fact that we have a high value premium organic product, we have a very good customer base for that, but it's not something that could exponentially grow like the salmon side of the business could. So we definitely see ourselves transitioning as we start getting into larger salmon production systems into other sorts of food crops like tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and focusing on those with the assumption that if we can grow cannabis, being such a tricky and finicky plant, that we can really grow anything.
That's great. Thank you. Paul, Rudi talked about the IoT that they're using in their facility. What other kinds of technologies are you using in your facilities?
I would say that we're relatively low tech at our facility at the current moment. I mean, we use what we need to basically get by at the at current state. Like our objective has been to basically commercialize, get to a cash flow positive state, and capture our market. And so the IoT involved is like kind of, basically what you need to get by in a farm. So we're obviously measuring, all the key parameters to make sure that plants grow well and that fish grow well, from water temperature, dissolved oxygen levels, and, different nutrient levels, and doing constant, lab tests to get specific nutrient levels. Like we do a lab test every week on that, and manipulate our nutrients based on that, and then taking things from a bit of weather data to our current operating temperatures in the farm that kind of triggers fans and louvers and different things like that. So we haven't really made a big data play or anything like that yet, but we've definitely been collecting everything, so that when we go forward, we kind of know what the perfect plant recipe is. And that's really, I would say, our next steps is just basically optimizing, and definitely like a big part of indoor vertical farming is data and IoT. And I think like that even leads back to the beginning question of like, what is food insecurity? And that to me is like, what is going on in the global supply chain, and looking at it from an economic standpoint of like, do we need to buy a year of inventory? Do we need to, how do we lean out, and all those different things. So I think like the future of that is definitely exciting. And that optimization question is something that we get to answer pretty soon. And that definitely gets me pretty excited because, we've compiled like 3 years of really good commercial data, and we've really developed a good plant growing recipe. And so now it's time for us to reinvest in our technology and figure out, how good can we do this?
Are there barriers that you're facing in kind of maybe even accessing some of the technology or support for growth? It sounds like you're both in kind of a growth phase. What kinds of barriers have you faced, or do you anticipate facing in the future?
I can go really quick on that one. So I think for us, like the biggest struggle we've been experiencing in the last couple of years has just been the uncertainty of COVID and the global pandemic. And now that things are kind of settling out, it's really, getting back to normal and allowing us to really think growth in that sense, because the last couple of years have really just been like battening down the hatches and making sure that we have basically our raw inputs ready so that we can continue to produce. Like, we were shipping things in from India and China and bringing in a couple shipping containers worth of materials that, we're in the ocean for like 6 months when typically it's like 2 months. And, like it's been like 10x the cost to bring stuff in. So I think that's really been a big barrier for us, is just that uncertainty and just kind of like wait and see. And now that things are kind of loosening up, you know, I think we're really ready to put the gas pedal down and just kind of let things rip. And yeah, I don't really think there's, you know, naively to say that a ton of barriers, but obviously I would just say like typical market barriers and competitive forces that require us to think strategically.
These are exciting times.
And agriculture is a very capital intensive endeavor, even if you're just doing terrestrial agriculture. I mean, land's not cheap, equipment's not cheap. So going in, and when you go into kind of the spaces that Paul and I are in, the equipment in that side is not cheap either. And the LED lighting and all the technology that gets deployed into that is not it's very capital intensive. And so with Paul scaling up and with us going into scale up mode here, we're entering a very capital intensive period. And I think that's a big part in any business is growing. How do you attract that capital? How do you grow and minimize dilution so that you can kind of maintain more of what you're working towards and really still scale and grow the business, because farming is a business of scale. Even if you're local, even feeding Calgary is a big project. So that's a big component of it, and going into that with inflation where it's at right now, with supply chains being uncertain in terms of just needing to time out when you're planning a farm and you have your engineering and construction all lined up, and you start having 8-month delays on certain equipment, that can be a huge problem in terms of viability of the project, or how much money you're going to be burning until you actually get production online. So those are right now, that's some of our biggest focus is on that and the barriers. Early on, it was the regulation and policy side of things, the DFO and dealing with salmon and having to go through federal licensing. From that side took us 18 months, and we weren't able to sell the fish we were producing, and they wanted us to destroy the initial crops instead of being able to sell them. And so just certain battles in that regard, just with the federal fisheries department. And then cannabis, going into cannabis is not super straightforward. So there was some challenges in that, but we've since gotten into a very good routine and rhythm in how we deal with the regulatory side of things, and moving forward, we're quite comfortable with that. So, but for anyone starting out, that's definitely something that you need to keep an eye on.
Sounds like a lot of work, Rudi.
It can be, but
Yeah.
it's definitely rewarding once you get through the initial startups. And I mean, starting anything can be a challenge, any business. And so when you're going into that, that's why entrepreneurs, I think, are very proud of the companies and the successes that they've had, because they get to see the successes, and it's the entrepreneurs and the people building the businesses that get to feel every inch that's gained from it. So that's part of the journey and part of the fun. It's
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. We actually got a couple questions in the chat here that I'd like to share. So H. Peter is asking, is solar energy viable for the facilities that you're mentioning on the BC coast?
Sorry, the question was solar?
Yeah, is solar energy a viable option for your facilities?
In certain regions, it can be. Right now, the cost of installing solar for what you get for it isn't quite a viable option in terms of just the consistency of power that you would need. You'd spend the same amount connecting to BC Hydro, and BC in the form of its, depending on how you view dams and hydroelectric power, it's very unique in terms of all of its power comes from a carbon-free, I guess, non-hydrocarbon based energy source. So we haven't focused so much in BC on trying to adjust our power source from a sustainability aspect, but we have had some quotes on solar power, and it hasn't been a viable addition yet for us.
Yeah, we've had a different Yeah, like energy has been my biggest question for the longest time because we consume a lot of electrical energy. Even though our LEDs are super efficient, we just have so many lights. And so like energy is our biggest cost right now. And so that's definitely something that we're trying to address. And we actually have, we are actually really strongly considering solar energy on our facility, albeit we want the government to subsidize it to make it more economical and have a quicker ROI. And so we have definitely applied for a lot of grants. And so right now we actually have a quote in to bring our facility to net zero using solar, which would be, I believe it would actually give us a very strong competitive advantage. And I think it is becoming viable, given like if you can, but it's got to be subsidized at this point, I think, until the costs are cut in half or the output doubles. So I think like right now, if the government can subsidize or if we can cut the capital costs in half, it becomes viable for us. So I think like given, you know, laws of technology, that's going to happen pretty quick given that with solar. But for us, like the biggest question mark is around energy and utilization of that.
And you have a lot more sun out in Alberta than we do.
We do. We have a ton of sun, right? So
which makes solar a little more challenging.
Yeah. So I think geographically we're positioned well to take advantage of that.
Thank you. We've got another question. Where is Barramundi available in Calgary for retail individual customers?
June 1st, all over. No, so our we shut down our Barramundi production in October and transitioned it to a new farm that we've partnered with. And so we're hoping that the Barramundi are market size at the end of May. And so the first places it's going to be available is in the live market, primarily the Asian grocery stores such as T&T, Lucky, and a couple other in Calgary and Edmonton. It will be available to food service immediately when the fish are ready in May or June. And then we'll be transitioning to retail probably by fall, where we hope to have a fully processed product available in all leading grocery stores.
There you go, Peter. Not long to wait. Elise Wasser, if I've pronounced your name correctly, has a question. With such complex systems, I'm assuming that the cost of operations is higher than that of traditional farming models. With that in mind, can aquaponics be used to produce lower priced crops such as corn or other staple crops in terms of a business feasibility, in your opinion?
I mean, that's, she's 100% correct on that, where there's definitely when starting up, there's higher costs associated with it as we've developed our system and really minimized and automated the system. It's really brought down our labor costs and even our energy efficiency on the system. So in terms of it being economical, 100%, you do have to be very selective on the crops that you're growing. Right now, the highest value crops are going to be your cash crops and the tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, leafy greens that Paul grows are extremely high value, strawberries and other berries. So it's limited really to those greenhouse type crops right now, because corn and the different grains and pulses are just, in terms of the terrestrial agriculture and the monocropping farming model that's still ongoing in those sizes, incredibly hard to compete with in terms of cost per bushel is what that would end up turning into. So there hasn't been really any, and Paul, maybe you've being out in the prairies have run into it more, but I haven't seen any real attempts on growing kind of the grains or cereal.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% correct. Like in the crops that you've named being primarily greenhouse crops, the way I look at it is that those crops that were mentioned, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, strawberries, those are all products that are traditionally grown in Arizona, California, Mexico. Therefore, those are imported products. And so I think the real opportunity in terms of, call it a controlled environment agriculture, which is what we're doing, is in crops that are being imported and things that we don't grow well in a northern climate year round. And obviously we don't grow crops year round, but we grow crops that
I think maybe Paul is frozen a little bit.
I think he might have frozen. We can.
Yeah. There's a bit of a follow-up question from Bernadette, wondering why, Rudi, you decided to go with cannabis as your crop versus something like microgreens. Bernadette, did Rudi address that question already?
No, I think, I mean, there's a bit of a backstory to that as well in terms of how we got into the aquaponics space, because my background was primarily in ranching and sustainable agriculture from that side, and building up an ecosystem using
can hold their value year round.
Oh, looks like he's in. But well, my business partner on the bison ranch was involved in the medical cannabis space, and so I was introduced to that side of the business, the hydroponic side of the business, and the technologies that surrounded indoor agriculture. Well, at the same time, was introduced to Paul at university. We were in the same program in the entrepreneurship department, and in some of our conversations, Paul and I were just brainstorming and thought that it'd be a great idea to use what the concept that he'd been playing with in aquaponics for cannabis. And so Paul and I really built a relationship up around that. We ended up not working together on that project. He stayed in the food side, and we continued on the development of it in the cannabis space. But I guess short answer to that is we had someone on our team that was experienced in the cannabis space and wanting to take that forward into the recreational space, and I wanted to pair that with sustainable farming, because standalone indoor agriculture isn't as sustainable as being able to link farms together in a symbiotic way and reduce the waste streams and carbon emissions. So that's how we ended up with cannabis.
Thanks, Rudi. We got you back, Paul.
Yeah, I think I'm here now.
Okay, yeah, we can hear you now. One other question that's in the chat. It sounds like water, this is from Andrew McCauley. It sounds like water quality is incredibly important to both of you. How often are you testing or treating your water?
We test daily for all variety of things. We test for ammonia, nitrate, different CO2 levels, water temperature, pH. So we're constantly monitoring the water quality and treating the water. The treatment of the water is an ongoing process. So it's a daily monitoring and daily additions of different pH control and keeping that going on a steady state, because the water you don't want fluctuating.
Yeah. Like I'm sure you guys operate with, probes and everything like that too, Rudi, that are, like we have data that's live streaming constantly for ours, because like with the plants, I mean, the pH changes and EC changes, which is like the electroconductivity, which measures the nutrients in the water, is constantly fluctuating. We're always like automated systems continually adjusting that. And so like basically nonstop with the plants on that side, and with the fish, like you're always monitoring your dissolved oxygen levels, like nonstop. That's always live streamed. And like for us, that's like, you get an alert if things drop below a threshold. And then things that like probes exist, but are way too expensive to operate. I mean, you're just using basically your aquarium test to check nitrogen and ammonia and stuff like that. And that's I mean, you're doing that every day, twice a day at least, to make sure things are on point and operating. So
Len, did that answer your question too? Len had a similar question.
There's one about like the treating of the water, and I mean, yeah, like you have to treat, like things happen. I mean, your pH goes up, you add acid, it goes down. You add basically baking soda. And so, yeah, there's lots of things you can do to treat your water depending on what's going on with it. Yeah.
We've got another question here from just to kind of follow on with this theme a little bit. H. Peter is asking, besides salmon and barramundi, are there other kinds of fish your facilities can produce for the commercial and retail markets? They're asking about shellfish.
Shellfish. Well, there's a lot, like the species that have been done that I'm aware of. There's walleye that's done, rainbow trout, Arctic char, striped bass, and sturgeon, tilapia, and then what Paul's doing with the barramundi, and then different species of salmon or salmonoids.
And that's specifically land-based recirculating aquaculture. Right. And so also there's shrimp is up and coming as well. There are a couple shrimp farms that are operating, viability to be determined, but I think it is showing a strong case.
And shellfish, I know people have explored shellfish through a filtration type process, like helping with filtering solids out of the water in the systems. The issue with that is the way that they reproduce. It's very hard to catch the eggs and then how they reproduce, and a lot of times it can end up in the pipes, and then you can end up clogging your pipes, and obviously that's very problematic. So I know that people have played around with it, and same with the shrimp. It's the feasibility of it is to be determined still.
Yeah, specifically land-based shrimp. Like I know there's shrimp farms in Florida and stuff like that, but I think they're more so not necessarily totally land-based. There's a shrimp farm in Toronto, and there's actually a shrimp farm in Strathmore, which is just east of Calgary. I believe it's called Waterford Farms, if anybody wanted to Google it.
Len, it looks like you've got a specific question with regards to your own experience. I wonder if you wanted to come off mute. Is that a thing that you can do? Do you have a mic?
Yes, I do. What I was wondering is, you guys seem to be chasing your tail on pH values and whatever. My pH value has changed a couple of points over the course of a month, and it's always down. I can mediate that with oyster shells, and it comes back up to about 7.0, and then over a couple of months, it'll go down to about 6.5.
So yeah, nitrification as a process is an acidic process. Don't ask me the specifics. I'm not a scientist, but I know that nitrification does cause your pH to go down. With the amount of water that we use, being in Calgary, it's very basic. So we always have to treat it to bring it down while we bring it into the system. But the nitrification naturally will just acidify your water. On the plants as well, like the process of plants uptaking nutrients also changes the water chemistry into an acidic balance. And so when we actually add the water, it kind of balances our stuff out, but we try to control very precisely because we do not want any fluctuation. And so, controlling it down to the decimal point is important for us. And so I think it could just be a question of scale as well, because it changes for us. So.
Yeah, we don't spend a lot of time on pHing on the recirculating aquaculture side. We have a daily addition of different hydroxide powders that go into the system that are certified organic, and we just have an amount based off of of a calculation of how much ammonia we're producing in the system that just keeps the pH dead on 7. The digester through its own process of breaking down has a need to control its pH as well. But really where we see the biggest fluctuations where we have to control is in the plant side. It's a day-to-day depending on the life cycle of the crop and how much they're drinking of the nutrient solution. It can, it's called, change the pH pretty rapidly. So we're always doing pH down in our plant side, but I think that's due mostly from the higher nitrate levels in the system. Every time it uptakes a nitrate molecule, it'll release a a hydroxide molecule, which then drives the pH up. And so the more of that you have in the water, the more your pH will fluctuate. So that's just, there's the fun with water chemistry.
Okay, I started with very basic water, much as Paul did. It started at 7.8. It slowly dropped to 7.0 and then gradually down to 6.5, at which point I added the oyster shells. It came back up slowly to 7.0, and my plants have never stopped growing so fast in their lives. They just love that slightly acidic water. And the fish love it as well.
Yeah, plants like slightly acidic water. That's where they'll thrive, and that just has to do with the availability of the different nutrients. And a lot of times in a water-based system, you're tweaking things to access some of your micronutrients like iron and some of the metals that are really sensitive to pH levels in terms of the uptake into the plant.
And I think that goes back to the point, Rudi, of that you mentioned, the decoupled system, right? So when you're operating a hobby system, like, you know, you have some flexibility in terms of your growth rates and yields, and so you can sacrifice your pH in the plants and on the fish for an optimal level. Like I think we operate our fish around a 7.8 or an 8 on the pH, and our plants at a 5.6. And you know, if we don't have 5.6, our plants are not happy, and our growth rates are different. And you know, the plants are moody. Like if our pH changes half a 0.5, like we see outcomes that are irreversible. So it's very specific to our needs and crop dependent. I mean, every crop is different and reacts different. Every species within a crop is different as well.
I think what we're hearing today leads to a question that we have in the chat from Bukola. Is there space from the two of you for mentorship? Do you have the time?
The time would be the question, but always open to answer questions to the best of our ability. And we're always open to have people out for tours to show the system. I know it sounds like a very complex system, but when you explain the system versus when you tour someone through the system, it makes a lot of sense. And you see the light bulbs go off on when you tour people through and what's needed and how the farm works. So anytime people want to come out to the shoe shop and see the farm, happy to accommodate on that side. And like I said, happy to answer questions and support in whatever way I have capacity for.
So there you go, Andrew. I think that answers your question as to what your next trip is, in order for them to describe the sustainable fish production setup and what it looks like. You could go see for yourself. I'm just noting the time. We've only got 3 minutes left. So I did want to just kind of ask you both a little bit about your experience at Mount Royal and how that contributed to the success that you've both achieved in the recent years.
Well, that's a loaded question with everybody at Mount Royal.
That's right. Be careful what you say.
No, I mean, it was definitely crucial in me finding my identity as fitting into the entrepreneur bucket. I didn't know I was an entrepreneur until I met Ray. I had an idea. I was planning on doing something from in the bison farming space. Like anybody at university in their first years, you're kind of figuring out what exactly you're doing. Do you want to go? You're going to be an accountant? Are you going to be a lawyer? You're going to what's the path? And so really the guidance of the entrepreneurship program there was crucial for me in really finding that community, that support, and I think that confidence to actually go and pursue the path that I'm on right now.
Yeah, and I echo that. I 100% would not be in this position had it not been for being introduced to the innovation of the entrepreneurship program at Mount Royal, Institute of Innovation and Entrepreneurship.
You got it.
And everybody involved in that program, from Ray and Jen and just the whole alumni community and the current students that are in that. And so just getting a very practical exposure to how to, you know, test and validate a product in a market and find your customers. And yeah, so without that, I can confidently say that I would not be in this position. So
Yeah. And you both talked before we got started. You both talked about the opportunities in Launchpad, and I know we've got some folks from the Institute of Entrepreneurship and Innovation here, and we just had, I think, Paul, I saw you at Launchpad too. I wonder if they would want to just mention a couple of the other initiatives that support students, if we've got some current students in the audience today. Maybe Sam or Diana. I think Ray is here too.
Thanks, Gary, so much. As all the folks mentioned here today, we just had our Launchpad stage competition on April 7th. And both Rudi and Paul were competitors in that in past years. If you are a student in the room who is interested on working an idea or working on a new venture and you feel like you're going to be the next Launchpad competitor, check out Launchpad Lab, which we will start recruiting for again in September. Feel free to shoot myself or Sam Begelfor, who's also in the room, an email. We'll stick our emails in the chat as well as a link to our website. We also, for those folks who are interested in the innovation and entrepreneurship space but are pre-idea, run 2 other programs. One is called the Innovation Sprint, where you get real job experience with an innovative Calgary company, which Carrie has been part of with me, as well as Connect for Social Entrepreneurs for those socially interested folks in the room. So thanks for giving me a chance to share. I'll drop those links in the chat, and thanks for coming, Rudi and Paul.
Thanks, Diana.
And the only 10 seconds I'll add is Rudi and Paul are exceptionally well versed right now, and they sound so damn polished. I can't believe it. That is not the bar to become a student entrepreneur. When I first met them, man, many years ago, they were just like every other student who's trying to figure it all out. So don't be intimidated. This is what you'll be like in several years, not right away. So engage early.
This is what happens when you have support from Ray and his team. Brad, if we've got community members or alumni even in the group here, and people are interested in some of the other learning opportunities that we have at Mount Royal University, I wonder if you could share some of the programs that is under your leadership.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie, and great discussion, Rudi and Paul. Thanks so much. I think for us, we really deal with the students that we have in the faculty are mid-career professionals. They're folks who are kind of coming back to, take some career enhancement programs. In terms of emerging technologies, I think we look at some emerging areas such as, cannabis and tech and esports. I think we also work, like Rudi mentioned earlier about, navigating the marketing regulations around cannabis. I mean, those are some of the programs that we offer, helping students with some best practices around some of those industry landmines, if you will, for some of those sectors. But I think, one of the things we also do is we also bridge vision with operations as well too. So, teaching and giving some brush up on best practices in terms of just business acumen. Regardless of what sector we're in, we're all working with people. And so, some leadership skills, some HR, some strategic planning, change management, all those types of sort of tools that we as leaders require on our tool belt. So yeah, check it out. And we also know that people are busy. And Paul and Rudi are a great example. I can't imagine what their calendars are like. And we do offer flexible programming for folks, knowing that they are busy.
Thank you, Brad. I know that there's also the entrepreneurship program as well, as you mentioned there as well. So support for entrepreneurs and our students, I think, is throughout the campus. I think what's really nice that we're seeing in the relationship between Paul and Rudi is that continuing relationship that continues to last beyond the institution, where you get to lean on each other for information. And it's I think it's a lovely community that you've built. And we very much appreciate you coming back and continuing to share with our community as alumni, and coming back to share your experiences, the learning that you continue to do, and more importantly, the successes that you're having in your businesses. We really appreciate you sharing that with us today. It's inspiring. I found it inspiring today, and from the comments in the chat, I suspect that there are lots of other people who found this inspiring too.